There's something very interesting about one of the youngest craters on the moon. It's the one named Aristarchus after the famous Greek scientist. And let's have a look at the story of it. So here we go. Well, this is where it is. It's the little bright spot up at the top left-hand side of the moon. When you look at it, you can see it best when the moon is fairly full. Moon rock has a special characteristic that it tends to scatter light straight back to you, called specular reflection, and so you can see the bright areas standing out like this once you get to a fairly full moon. This is just past full moon here, with the day-night boundary, the so-called terminator, beginning to sweep round from the right-hand side there, making those craters stand out nicely. But you can still see some of the really bright craters, and the brightest one of the lot is indicated there. That is Aristarchus. Now, when people started photographing this, it started all kinds of interesting rumours, and we'll see why. The first and most obvious one is aliens. Some people say that it's an alien fusion reactor, and you can kind of see why if you look at this image here that tends to be circulated. It looks to be glowing away there, and it looks to have some sort of ring structure with segments emerging from it. Well, what's going on? Well, here is an image actually from another one on Earth, perhaps, you might think. It's a great big strange dome in the desert here. But what's really going on is the picture's been turned upside down. This is in fact an image of meteor crater. So it's not a dome at all. It's a big hole in the ground. It's an optical illusion that our brain sees the picture when it's inverted as sticking up above the desert floor rather than being a giant hole in it. So if we look back to Aristarchus, here again we have the image of that apparent dome structure sticking up, glowing away there. But what's really happening is the picture's upside down, and if you turn it round, I think it looks less like a dome. It still looks a bit weird, but it doesn't necessarily quite jump out at you that this is sticking up. It looks a little bit more like it's a depression, but it still looks like an alien reactor. What happens, though, if you get a bit closer and get some better photographs? Well, sadly, a much better, more focused image, and you begin to see there's just a crater. It's an impact crater. It's got a small lump in the center, and just above it, there is some of the ejecta and another crater which has a long rill or lava tube moving away from it. Now, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has produced some fantastic photographs, and this is one of them of Aristarchus. Shows the crater, 42 kilometers in diameter, and it is one of the youngest of the craters on the moon. That's why it's so bright. The fresh material has been brought to the surface by the impact, and on the moon, the longer that material is exposed to the radiation of the solar wind coming from the sun, lots of charged particles, it tends to turn the material darker and darker with age. So the dark bits of the moon are the most elderly, the ones that have been exposed to the solar wind for the longest. The bright bits, they're very freshly turned up, newly exposed material. But LRO has done even better, and this is a picture of the central mountain here. So I think we can just see this is indeed just a mountain with the shadow at the top there. So sadly, no alien reactor. Now, these central mountains are interesting. They form in most craters. This one's perhaps a slightly strange shape, but most impact craters form when a bolide, a meteor, comes in, smashes into the ground, and of course on the moon they tend to hit without being slowed down by the atmosphere, because there isn't one, as would happen on Earth. So they arrive at great speed, and as the diagram shows, it punches a hole in the ground which then rebounds upwards, creating this central peak in the middle of the crater. I've got a little animation here of a water droplet falling, and you can see the rebound. There it goes a few times. You see the effect of the rebound up in the center there. And of course, that happens, the rock gets liquefied and behaves rather like the water, rather like a very sticky version of the water. And it tends to freeze in position as it cools. leaving the central raised mountain as a permanent feature, which obviously doesn't happen with the water. So here's another animation on the left-hand side here of the shock wave and the material melting, the ejector flying outwards, and then slumping back down to form the crater walls and the overshoot and rebound leading to that classic crater shape. So the other thing that's strange about Aristarchus is that it does seem to be very blue in colour, a sort of electric blue coloration to it. Got two pictures here. The big one on the right is from Galileo doing a flyby, which took a picture of the crater out there towards the day-night limb of the moon there. It looks fairly white, but there is a hint of blue. But in the Clementine photo from 2 years later, as that passed by even closer, you've definitely got that electric blue. And that's the weird thing about it, is that it only really looks blue to us through telescopes just on when the light is absolutely right, within sort of 1 or 2 days of the correct phase of the moon do we get this weird electric blue color. Here's another photograph, and I think this really does show the blue. What's happened here is they've wound the color contrast, the saturation, up a little bit, and you can see the electric blue crater. You can also see how the ejector blanket and the outflow from the volcanic eruptions, which have caused some of those lava tubes that you can see wiggling across the surface there. Those are sort of brown in color. And then you've got the other material, which is a sort of slate gray with a tinge of blue from the surrounding area. And these are different minerals. There's a lot more titanium in the blue surround and a lot more iron in the browner areas. So the moon does look to have some color if you use a camera and try and wind the color up a little bit. It's quite amazing. There we have it a bit closer. You can see that central mountain. I think it's a fascinating picture, this one. Got a lot of detail in it. Here's another one. We can zoom right in on the whole plateau. You can see that actually there is a raised area, which is the volcanic part of the system, with the features leading away from it, called Schroeter's Valley, which is that collapsed lava tube that's been leading away from these ancient volcanoes. And then you've had the modern impact over to the left-hand side there that's made that big crater. So it's a combination of an older volcanic system and a crater that happens to have landed on top of it. There's another detailed picture of the 160-kilometer long collapsed lava tube of Schroeter's Valley. Now we see these on Earth. We see lava tubes. I've been inside one in Iceland. Fascinating to go down and have a look. Here's a picture of another one, an even bigger, longer one in the Kazumara cave in Hawaii. It's just incredible to see these. Lava would have been flowing down here, and then what happens is that where it's exposed at the top and the edges, it cools fastest and solidifies there, protecting the hotter lava flowing down the tube. And then, of course, eventually the volcano stops erupting and the lava flows out the far end, leaving these hollow tubes. Now, Aristarchus has also been associated not only with nuclear reactors and being a strange blue colour, but with activity on the moon. Sometimes people say the moon is geologically dead. They talk about the fact that it's a small body and it must have lost all of its heat to space and cooled right off, and that there can't be any volcanic activity anymore. But lots of people in history have reported what we call transient lunar phenomenon, TLPs. These are strange changes in the picture of the moon, the image that we see, and sometimes we have some photographs of this that probably confirm that something happened. The picture at the top right, captured in May of 26, is an interesting case. There's a sudden little bright flash, and it's probably a meteor hitting the moon, creating that flash. I mean, meteors hit the Earth all the time. They must hit the moon all the time. And the modern trend of lots of cameras everywhere is meaning that we're beginning to see some of these events. On the other hand, down at the bottom right-hand corner, when you look at the moon through a small telescope and you're looking through the Earth's atmosphere at it, the turbulence in the Earth's atmosphere can cause the image to wobble backwards and forwards. And if you watch that image, not only do the parts of the image wobble, but occasionally bits of them suddenly brighten up, just by the chance way that the optics are behaving with that turbulence. And that can cause people to think that there's something going on. So it's been very much a controversial subject as to whether or not these transient lunar phenomena are real. And the map on the left is showing where people think they've observed them, and the larger the circle, the more often they've been observed. So actually the most common area for seeing them seems to be around the Aristarchus area. So that's definitely an area of interest for this sort of thing. So is this a picture of one? Well, there's the moon in its ordinary position, and here we see a bright flare up in another image of the moon, not so good quality, but there you have it, where there's a sudden brightening. So maybe something was happening there. Maybe it was a meteorite, maybe though it was a small outburst of some sort, and the Apollo landers did detect some evidence of small moonquakes, so we're not absolutely sure what's going on. It's possible that the Aristarchus area is still volcanically active and is still producing at least gaseous eruptions. Apollo 15 in 1971 flew over the area and detected radiation, alpha particles, which seem to have come from decay of the radioactive gas radon-222, and that would have come from the decay of heavy elements like uranium in the lunar crust, turning into radon eventually, and the radon gas can then bubble up slowly and float around in the vicinity of the moon. So for Apollo to detect it, there must be a reasonable amount of it there. And in fact, that was confirmed just in 1998 by the Lunar Prospector mission, which also went past. Other gases that have been detected in fairly modest amounts, of course, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide. So for them to be present, they must have a source. It must be leaking out of the moon's crust, even if it's not a violent eruption. Now, in fact, Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has detected about 70 young volcanic structures across the moon, marked on the map there. It maps that rectangle, and we see it there with all the little dots on it, and the bright yellow dot on the left, that's Aristarchus again. So there are some clusters in various parts of the moon. Very interesting how it's not scattered randomly, but there are definite signs of something going on there. Now, in 1953, Dr. Leon Stewart, pictured here with his homemade telescope, look, saw a flash on the moon and actually managed to take a photograph of it. And again, it's another one of these cases. But the Clementine satellite has been able to follow up on that many years later, 1994, so 41 years afterwards. And yeah, we can see that there is a fairly new crater roughly in the right spot. So this was probably another impact event. Here it is again, another picture of it, a little tiny white spot in the inset region on the left. But there are other reports of somewhat more spectacular things that were seen just with the naked eye. And if we go all the way back to Giordano Bruno in the year 1178, 18th of June, he reported as follows. He reported an hour after sunset from the midpoints of the flaming division, a flaming torch sprang up and spewing out over a considerable distance fire, hot coals and sparks. So what he was saying there is that he was observing the horns of the moon when it was a very thin crescent, and suddenly it erupted in flames and fire from his point of view. It was also reported by a group of 5 monks from Canterbury in the UK. They said there was a bright new moon, and as usual in that phase, its horns were tilted towards the east, and suddenly the upper horn split in two. From the midpoint of this division, a flaming torch sprang up, spewing out over a considerable distance fire, hot coals and sparks. roughly the same description. Meanwhile, the body of the moon, which was below, writhed, as it were, in anxiety. And to put it in the words of those who reported it to me and saw it with their own eyes, so this is a second-hand report, the moon throbbed like a wounded snake. Afterwards, it resumed its proper state. The phenomenon was repeated a dozen times or more. That's interesting, isn't it? The flame assuming various twisting shapes at random and then returning to normal. Then after these transformations, the moon from horn to horn, that is along its whole length, took on a blackish appearance. So something fairly significant happened here. You could put it down to a meteor strike, except for the fact that it says the phenomenon was repeated a dozen times. That sounds more like there was an eruption, a volcano going off. Very interesting indeed. Now, this is the image of the crater, though, that Apollo 11 followed up and took. Now, we think this is the crater that they are talking about. It's a new crater, very much dates to around about the right time, very, very young indeed. And it seems to have a classic ejector blanket around it of material being hurled out and the right sort of shape for an impact crater rather than a volcano. But very interesting that they reported it erupting a dozen times. That just seems wrong for a simple impact event, which would be a sudden event and all over very rapidly. Now, this crater is right on the edge of the moon, making it very, very difficult to observe. In fact, as the moon goes around the Earth, because it's in a slightly elliptical orbit, it might try to keep one face pointing towards us, but it spins on its axis at a fixed speed. So it takes a whole month to rotate on its axis while it revolves around us in its orbit in exactly a month, but at a variable speed. So when it's closest to the Earth, it's moving faster. When it's further away, it moves more slowly. This is all down to gravity and Kepler's laws and Newton's laws of planetary motion. And the result of that is that the view from Earth, we managed to see about 57% of the total area of the moon, because at times some parts of it appear over the horizon and some disappear on the corresponding opposite side as we go through the month. And Bruno's crater is right on the edge, so that sometimes it appears visible and sometimes not. But it's very, very difficult for us to see it directly from Earth. So, of course, Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter to the rescue. This is the giant hole in the ground. But bizarrely, we think it's 4 million years young, this crater. So it can't have been an impact that Bruno witnessed. He wasn't around 4 million years ago. He was around in the year 1100 or so. So it just doesn't quite add up. This is still a bit of a mystery. If anyone knows the answer, I'd welcome it in the comments. It was suggested that this was formed by the crater, and then there were eruptions from underneath, but who knows. Now, other stories about things that were observed on the moon. Well, we go back to this chap, Baron Franz von Gruthausen. He suggested that craters were impact events. Previous to that, everybody thought they were volcanoes. And of course, Sir Patrick Moore was keen on the volcanic idea right up through the 1960s. So it was around for a very long time. Difficult to tell without really good images, but now that we have them, it seems obvious that the vast majority are in fact these impact craters. But the Baron also identified what he thought was a walled city on the moon. I've inset it on the overlay there of one of his drawings of this walled city that he thought he'd discovered. And of course, he produced a more detailed diagram of it. Again, this is a hand-drawn image. It was before the days of photography, and so you were reliant on looking with a telescope through that wobbly image that you see through the Earth's atmosphere and trying to identify it. So there we have it. Now, I suspect this is more a case of just over-interpreting what you could see, a bit like the whole business about the canals on Mars, people seeing straight lines out of a series of dots and so forth. So I'm afraid there isn't really a walled city there at all. Now, if we go back to the idea of the different colors of the moon, this is an image of the full moon that I took. You've got Aristarchus up at the left, Tycho crater at the bottom. You can see some of the really bright material. That's the young, freshly dug up material, whereas the mare, the seas on the moon, are the smoother, flat looking, large areas, and they're very dark. Now, because they're dark, this tends to mean they're very ancient and that they've been exposed to the sun for a very long time. So these are the older parts of the moon, dating back about 4 billion years. Here's a coloured picture of those mare, those seas of the moon, trying to indicate how old we think they are. And you can see that most of this is in the blue part, which tends to indicate 3.5 to 3.8 billion years old. The Sea of Tranquility, Mare Tranquillitatis, where the Apollo 11 mission landed, that's even older, up to 4 billion years. But over near towards the left-hand side of the diagram there, we do have some rather younger material, and that's emerged more recently and been exposed to the solar wind for less time. So it's very interesting. And these, of course, are giant puncture wounds. Most of these large features that you see are circular, and they are from huge impacts into the surface of the moon, punching right through and allowing material to come up and flow across the surface from the molten interior of the moon way back at the time. Another mission that's been to the moon to study this is the Lunar Grail mission of 2011, a gravity probe. It's a pair of satellites orbiting the moon and studying how the slight variations in the force of gravity could be used to map the structure and the density of the moon itself. So you've got the optical picture of the moon on the left, and then the gravity picture giving the height in the middle, and then the gravity gradients. So it's the how much the gravity is changing on the right. And I think if you look at the picture on the right, you can really make out that these things were giant impacts. They're obviously circular puncture wounds in the surface of the moon for a lot of the mare. And then there's one massive, but not quite perfectly circular wall going almost all the way round, a great big scar on the moon covering most of that surface. Follow the blue line around. That's probably one absolutely enormous impact very early on. And we know it's earlier than all the others because they're on top. They've happened afterwards. So it's likely that the moon, when it formed in orbit around the Earth, as a result of an impact of a large object into the Earth, a lot of material was blasted off into orbit around the moon, and it either formed a disk and then the moon coalesced out of the disk, or more likely, several smaller moonlets all formed. So the moon might have originally had a bunch of sister moonlets, and this giant impacts that we see here could well be this moon that we now have merging with its smaller sisters. And that would be a sort of fascinating thing to be able to go and prove, wouldn't it? Now, here's another impact that was caught in the event, the impact on the left there, just to the right of the Aristarchus crater. You can see the inset where the bright flash is. And then we've also got an image on the right of the sort of before and after of this moonscape with no crater, and then a young bright material being thrown up, nice new crater being formed. So it's pretty solid evidence for it. Here's another one. This was actually caught in the act, and this was in 2012. Again, you can see the crater eruption and the before and after photograph. In 2003, comet EH1 smashed into the moon, or at least part of it did, and you can see the bright flash caught in this little video. So these impacts really do happen, and the more people are pointing cameras at the moon, the more often we're discovering them. So the moon's far from the boring grey thing covered in craters. There is stuff going on there, and it's well worth having a look. And so we'll end this little presentation just with this really nice picture of the Aristarchus crater area with that electric blue light. So thanks very much for listening, and more later.